Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 26, Islam. And one of those bizarre coincidences that seem to follow me around in life, I found when I got to Norfolk State that Dr. Naeem Akbar, the Muslim psychologist whose ideas on human development I had studied at St. Bridges, was teaching in the school's psychology department. So my first order of business was to go and meet this man, whose book, Natural Psychology and Human Transformation, had helped me view myself in a different light. We hit it off right from the start. Warm and sharp, he invited me to take a graduate course called African Psychology that he planned to teach that fall. After his conversion to Islam in the 1970s, Dr. Akbar had become a firebrand spokesman for the American Muslim mission. He blended his training as a psychologist and the theology of Islam to draft some of his ideas about the process of human development. The cat was so heavy that some of his students from Morehouse College in Atlanta, where he taught before coming to Norfolk, had followed him to NSU. In the African psychology class, Naeem, as we called him, introduced us to a whole body of literature and black scholars unheard of in mainstream thought. We studied African cultures and religions and talked about our ancestors' traditional belief that God is present in all things. We talked about how that belief fostered our ancestors' sense of connectedness to all things in creation, animals, plant life, and other human beings. And we contrasted this perspective to that of white people in America, who Naeem said are guided by a worldview in which they see themselves as separate from and superior to the rest of creation. That's what enables them to go in the forest and desecrate whole sections of trees for money, or to kill animals en masse for stylish furs, or to conquer other people of the world everywhere they come into contact with them, he said. As long as they see themselves as being separate and disconnected from other people, they'll feel no obligation to treat them as human beings. Naeem didn't teach that white people were evil, but he interpreted their behavior in a way that helped us better understand the roots and nature of racism. He told us that whites, adhering to the value system of the West, place a premium on conquering people and developing objects. He said that while that way of thinking has led to many technological advancements that have made the United States the most powerful nation in the world, it has virtually ignored advancements in human development and created a powerful country of dangerous, underdeveloped, primitive human beings. As an example, he talked about the flaws of standardized tests that measure quantities of facts but can't measure such things as creativity and potential. By contrast, he said, look at African Americans who generally don't score high on culturally biased standardized tests. We are the same people who, as slaves, took the leftover trash, intestines, that white folks gave us from the hog and turned it into a delicacy. Chitlins. We are the same people who took our hard time as slaves and created from it music, the blues and jazz, that the world loves. Those kinds of things are also a form of intelligence, but white people don't place much value on that kind of creative intellect. That helped me understand why so many white folks walk around thinking they know every goddamn thing, and why so many blacks are so psyched out with deep-rooted complexes about what they think they don't know. I never did well on standardized tests in school. That stuff bored me stiff. I'd answer questions till I got tired, then lay my head on the desk. Since I never scored high on those tests, I never thought I had much on the ball. Naeem's ideas about intelligence also made me think about the cats I came up with on the block. Dudes who never finished school, but in their own way were smart as hell. I thought about drug dealers like my old stickman Shell Shock. Given their business skills, I was sure they could run any corporation in America if given the chance. But they would never get an opportunity to do anything like that because they weren't considered smart by white folks' standards. Naeem tossed out another idea that was foreign to Western thought. He said that sensitivity is a form of intelligence. This is a radical concept considering that most folks in our society, especially men, generally view sensitivity as a weakness, and it suggested to me that maybe women, who are clearly more compassionate and sensitive than men, are more highly developed human beings and therefore more intelligent. That class I took in Naeem is one of those rare experiences from which the students come out forever changed. Years later, when I went into the system, the stuff Naeem laid on me helped me combat the psychological assaults by whites who constantly question black folks' intelligence. Largely because of Naeem's influence, I did in the free world what I hadn't done in prison. In 1979, I joined the American Muslim Mission. It was a change that had been coming for a long time. Islam seemed to address my nagging need to deal with my spiritual self and to worship in a faith that was not racially offensive to me. It got on my nerves every time I walked into a black Christian church and saw huge pictures of a long-haired, bearded Caucasian who was supposed to be Jesus. It let me know from Jump Street that those preachers were messing up black folks' head even more than they already were messed up. Without being aware, many black Christian preachers were promoting the notion of white supremacy, right along with white folks. The Muslims, on the other hand, were serious about prohibiting picture images of God or prophets in any race. I was also drawn by the Islamic idea that you can see evidence of a creator by studying the wonders of creation. When I learned Muslim lessons about the interconnectedness of nature and mankind, I could see it clearly. There is order to life, and man must find a way to get in harmony with that order. But I also liked the Muslims for non-religious reasons. They were survivors. Beyond some traditional civil rights groups, such as the NAACP and the Urban League, the Muslims were one of the few black organizations that had survived destruction by whites during the 1960s and 1970s, and they were realists. They recognized early on that all the civil rights begging and marching that black folks had done had produced very limited results for the masses of blacks. Unlike some of those mainstream traditional black groups that kept plodding ahead, running into brick walls, trying to gain acceptance into the system, the Muslims were willing to do something that black folks in general have had a hard time doing: change direction and try something different. Also, I saw that the Muslims were committed to self-help and to establishing black institutions. They went out into communities and tried to do something to improve black people's plight. They sought ways to build their own schools so that their children wouldn't be brainwashed and to build their own businesses to create employment and wealth that would benefit blacks. All that appealed to me. It annoyed the hell out of me that even after the death in 1975 of Elijah Muhammad, the one-time leader of the Nation of Islam, when his son began steering the group away from hatred of whites and separatist beliefs, the media continued to depict the Muslims as militant separatists because of their emphasis on self-help and black empowerment. Every ethnic group in the United States has maintained some of its own religious, educational, and business institutions to preserve what it's about, and that's all the Muslims have sought to do. The crazy thing was, no group of people in this country has been more separatist than white Americans. They did all they could to keep blacks out of their institutions, then turned around and accused the Muslims of being separatists simply because they stopped fighting to get in. It all struck me as deeply insane, and in joining the Muslims, I wanted to get as far away from American insanity as I could. I studied the Holy Quran, learned to speak some Arabic, and in keeping with the faith, prayed 5 times a day. It was tough trying to get used to praying 5 times a day. It seemed sometimes that I prayed more than I did anything else, but there was value in it. During the course of any day, you can come unglued. By praying 5 times a day, you can bring it all back together, refocus on your purpose and goals. My family, I'm sure, saw my devotion to Islam as part of some strange new black power trip, but nobody objected. Nobody said anything that indicated they didn't like what I was trying to be and do. My brothers were cool about it, and so were my parents. Mama was down for anything that kept me off the streets and out the joint. She sort of watched me quietly and asked questions about Islam every now and then. It was about the same with the fellas I once hung with. We were living such different lives that I seldom saw them. Shell Shock had stopped dealing drugs and gotten a job at the shipyard. Bimbo was working for the railroad. Shane was in and out of jail, and Frog, Lep, and the others were getting knocked around by life in various ways. Whenever I did happen to run into one of the boys from the old days, I could tell they were curious and puzzled, especially if I wore a Muslim kufi on my head. I'm sure they dismissed it as me being involved in some black shit. That's what a lot of folks said was somebody they knew got involved in efforts to work for their people or raise their consciousness. He done gone off into that black shit now. He wearing clothes like he think he an African or something. Frankly, I didn't care what anybody thought. I knew what I knew, and I believed that black shit was helping me become a better person. So I kept pressing forward. For a while, my life, including work, revolved around the Islamic principles I studied. I got a part-time gig working with Rasul, the guy at St. Bridget's who had first explained Islam to me. He was now supervising the print shop in Norfolk. In my second year at Norfolk State, I went to school full-time days and worked nights, often studying on the job while the presses ran. It felt good working for a black man, even though white folks owned the place. The Muslims emphasized the importance of marriage. Right away, when a guy joins the group, veteran brothers at the masjid, the local mosque, point out available sisters for the man to inspect. I understood the reason for the emphasis on marriage, but I thought they were a little too pushy about it. They talked about choosing a wife like it was as casual as picking fruit. Yvette joined the Muslims shortly after I did. I suspected that she joined because of me, but she insisted that she was attracted to Islam for reasons of her own. Her joining didn't hurt our relationship, that's for sure. We grew closer and hung tighter after that. After seeing Yvette and me leave the masjid one day together, a respected Muslim elder pulled me aside and said, "Brother, you know we don't believe in dating unchaperoned. Are you going to marry that sister?" I looked at him, cracked a defiant smile and said, "I have no intentions of getting married. I don't know if we're compatible enough to spend the rest of our lives together." The elder said, "That's the purpose of marriage. It gives you a lifetime to get acquainted." He said that if we both submitted to the will of Allah, compatibility would come natural. You would be in harmony with each other because you would both be submitting to the will of God. In short, the cat was telling me that Yvette and I couldn't keep hanging tight and sleeping together and remain active in the Muslim community. I shrugged off the elder's remarks and went on my way. But other guys made similar comments to me, and Yvette told me the Muslim women were laying the pressure on her too. I had promised myself once that I would never get married unless I was madly in love. Although I cared for Yvette a lot, I wasn't in love with her. But after hearing all those remarks about marriage and seeing Muslim converts hooking up like there was nothing to it, I began to reconsider my position. I thought, maybe I can grow into this thing. Maybe I can learn to love Yvette. In an act of faith and of affection for Yvette, I asked her to marry me. Naeem performed the wedding ceremony in the summer of 1979. Standing there beside Yvette during the ceremony, I listened to Naeem preach about the virtues of marriage and wondered what the hell I was getting into. I thought about how a little over a year after getting out the joint, my life had changed dramatically. I had entered college, joined a religious group, and was now getting hooked up, as we said on the block. It was scary and exciting at the same time. It was so much like me, living on the edge, trying to figure out what time it was. But things fall apart. It's like that one tiny piece of thread that you pull at in the shirt, thinking it will snap. And it stays together, unraveling until you look up, and the whole shirt is coming to pieces. That's how the next 2 years often seemed to me. Even as my life was changing in ways I couldn't quite see, it happened with Islam, and it happened again in my personal life. The first blow came when Naeem left. He accepted a teaching job at Florida State University in Tallahassee. While he was at Norfolk State, those of us in his class took our interaction beyond the classroom. We had monthly potluck dinners and Scrabble games, and held impassioned rap sessions about the impact of current events on blacks. It was just like the evening courtyard discussions at Southampton, but with women added to the mix. When Naeem left, the thread that held our intellectual potluck group together promptly fell apart. The members of our group didn't even think about getting together anymore after that. Naeem was also missing the masjid. The excitement generated by his presence and electrifying speeches and the optimism I felt about the wonderful things we could accomplish with him there leveled off. After Naeem's departure, minor complaints I had about the Muslims seemed to magnify. In my view, some of their actions contradicted their aims. They talked a lot about building black institutions, but many of the men were slow to develop the educational skills and get the knowledge required to carry it out. I thought we needed to focus more on large-scale economic projects, but a lot of the Muslim men seemed unable to get beyond nickel and diamond, selling jewelry, fruit, and bean pies on the street. When I questioned some of the Muslims about such contradictions, they played a lot of the same head games that Christians play. If you question things, they try to make you feel like you lack faith. If you don't go completely along with the program, they say you're not a true believer. Over time, I began to look around and examine the individual lives of people in the masjid. Many were uneducated and poor, and it seemed they would stay that way. Few, it seemed, really understood the system they wanted to replace. That's when I began to wonder if the dream of nation building was just that, a lofty but unreachable dream. There were also other things about the Muslims that bothered me, mainly their almost fanatical obsession with avoiding pork. I stopped eating pork in the penitentiary before I even thought about becoming a Muslim, but I thought some of them took that pork thing much too far. Before they ate anything packaged, they carefully read the label to see if the contents had been cooked in pork or made from pork products. That was okay, but it annoyed me that some of them were much more careful about what went into their bodies than what they allowed into their minds. One day, a group of brothers came to my house. I offered them something to eat. While we were standing around in the kitchen, one dude glanced in my cabinet and saw something that he said might have been cooked in some pork product. "Say, brother, don't you know that this stuff has some hog in it?" I said, "Nah, man, to tell you the truth, I hadn't noticed." He said, "Yeah, it does. And this too." By that time, he had his head sticking inside my cabinet, inspecting all my food. He even started reading the ingredients list on the side of a box of Rice Krispies. That did it for me. I was seething, pissed off, not so much because he pointed those things out, but because of the larger issue that had kept nagging me. How could they be so meticulous about something as trivial as what has or has not been cooked in pork and overlook more important matters, such as their need to get their overall education act together? That was a major blind spot I just couldn't abide. I was also uncomfortable with the role of women in the Islamic faith. In the masjid, women were regulated to the role of mother, cook, all that traditional stuff, while the leadership positions were held by men. That ran against the grain of all the thinking and reading I'd done in prison to try to free myself from the sexism that had led me to be so abusive toward women before. I didn't want a subservient woman, yet I joined a faith where people had different ideas about equality. While the men had less stringent dress codes, the Muslim women were required to wear long, flowing garb, even in the hottest weather, to ensure that no man besides their husband saw their legs, arms, and hair. The idea was that by covering themselves, they would not tempt men. I understood the logic, but it was a logic that relieved men of the burden of learning to control themselves. Yvette quietly struggled with such issues too. I asked her one day, "Aren't you tired of wearing that headpiece all the time?" She said, "Yeah, it's beginning to ruin my hair." I said, "The men don't have to cover their heads. From now on, you don't have to wear a headpiece. If anybody says anything to you about it, you've got my support." That, I think, marked my first outward move toward a break with the Muslims. I had become disillusioned and had begun to feel more confined than free. My attendance at the masjid dropped off gradually. Eventually, I stopped going altogether. After we got married, Yvette and I moved into a low-income neighborhood in Norfolk. The small one-bedroom apartment was crawling with roaches. It was a dump, really, but it was all we could afford. For a short while, married life seemed like it might agree with us. We got along okay, but the vibes were really bad between her mother and me. Yvette's mother made no secret of her wish that her daughter would have married a former boyfriend. Beyond that, I didn't know why she didn't like me. I resented that she could dislike me without getting to know me. That's how white folks treat blacks. I wasn't about to accept that. Whenever I went with Yvette to her mother's house, her mother would act aloof toward me. Yvette would always tell me things, silly, petty stuff that her mother had said about me. I guess Yvette wanted me to try to win her mother over, but I wasn't into brown nosing. I didn't back down from her mother's hostility. I told Yvette one day, "Your mama can go straight to hell." That didn't help our relationship at all. But that wasn't the worst of it. One of the biggest problems we had in our marriage stemmed from Yvette's job. She worked with the General Accounting Office, which audits government agencies. It turned out that there was a white man on her job who gave her hell, criticizing her Muslim faith and finding fault in everything she did. He made her feel that no matter how good she was not as qualified as him, even though they both held accounting degrees. I tried to coach her, but Yvette couldn't muster the will and anger to fight him back. She was one of those peaceful souls who hate conflict. Generally, that was one of the attributes I found appealing in her, but when it came to dealing with white folks, it seemed like a liability. I told her, "White folks will eat you alive if you don't fight back. They love a black person who lets them get away with their crazy shit." She still wouldn't fight back. That white man hounded her at work, and she brought her frustrations home to me. Sometimes, Yvette came home from work somber and beaten down. She slipped into month-long depressions and would mope around the house not saying much of anything. She'd cry at night and tell me how she was sure she knew how to perform her job. It was pitiful. It made me so mad that I thought a couple of times about going up to her job to confront that cracker, but every time I thought about it, I didn't feel in control. I felt that if a white man said the wrong thing to me, I'd do something I'd regret. Looking back, I think there was more to Yvette's unwillingness to fight than hating confrontation. I think that white man tapped into some racial self-doubt that she couldn't overcome. It was as if on some level she believed she was inferior and assumed that the white man must have been right about her incompetence. She said things that let me know she was giving in. Maybe I should quit my job and go back to school for a master's degree. She didn't need another degree. She needed to find an acceptable way to put her foot up that white man's behind, but she didn't, and he beat her down. I felt helpless standing on the sidelines, watching my wife being psychically ripped apart. I agonized over the matter and tried repeatedly to help her overcome it, and even recommended that she get counseling. She wouldn't go. She couldn't get past what she thought was the stigma, the idea that counseling is for crazy people. Eventually, her prolonged depressions began to drag us both down. We began fighting over her unwillingness to fight back on other fronts. We separated, and in 1981, got a quiet, uncontested divorce. Okay, this brings us to the end of chapter 26. And the thought that I have is I'm thinking about the idea of groups, how there is a strength that can be found in groups, but not when you have to conform so much to fit within that group. Like this idea that you can't question things or you're not a devout follower or a believer. I think that is bad. I think you should always be able to question things until you can find an understanding for yourself. Any group that tries to get you to not ask questions, that's somebody that or a group that wants to take advantage of you, in my opinion. But you guys let me know in the comments. Again, thank you for tuning in. This has been another chapter of Makes Me Want to Holler. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.